Welcome to Fins, Fur, and Feathers, the Fish and Wildlife Management podcast at K-State Research and Extension. I'm Dr. Drew Ricketts.
And I'm Dr. Joe Gerken. We're both lifelong hunters and anglers, K-State Research and Extension specialists who help citizens with their fish, wildlife, and pond management needs. If you've ever had a wildlife or pond management challenge, then this is the podcast for you.
We address common fish and wildlife management problems using a scientific approach to provide proven and practical solutions to the issues that you may be facing.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers, and we're going to chat today about some terrestrial topics, and we're going to talk about a popular game bird, I think, today, Drew.
Yeah.
What do you got for us?
Well, you know, we've been talking about critters that cause damage a lot, and so I thought maybe coming into summertime, a time of the year when habitat management ought to be on people's minds. If it's not, if they're trying to manage wildlife populations, we can talk about northern bobwhite quail, most popular game bird probably in North America. Definitely a very popular game bird in North America.
Yeah, fun hearing them calling and just seeing the coveys out there. So, are they causing problems? You said we've been talking about a lot of animals that cause problems. What are the problems of the quail other than they get my blood pumping too much maybe when I see them flush?
Yeah, that's probably the main one. I mean, I can't think of a human wildlife conflict, that involves bobwhite quail besides just getting startled by them every once in a while. That especially in the dark, like walking into a tree stand, or when I used to check traps as a kid a lot on foot in the dark in the morning, and you step into a covey of quail and there's coyotes howling off in the distance.
Something's coming to get you for sure.
Yeah.
So where are quail native to? Are they native to our area?
Yeah. So basically, if you're thinking about the native range of northern bobwhite, it would go from the Rocky Mountains east to the East Coast, and the northern boundary would be sort of a squiggly line that runs from like central South Dakota over to southern Pennsylvania, bounces around north to south a little bit throughout there. But then they go all the way down the east coast of Mexico into Central America, so pretty widespread bird.
Yeah, that is pretty widespread. Growing up, I remember my dad telling me stories of seeing lots of quail when he was young and hunting, but I don't recall, I didn't see a single quail. We went out fairly often. We weren't in the best habitats in Ohio, but I don't remember a lot of quail. So what do the populations look like over time? Was that just me being a bad hunter, or were the population numbers down?
Well, growing up in Ohio, you would have grown up far enough east and probably done a lot of hunting in an area far enough east that a lot of the quail habitat was already gone by the time you were old enough to hunt when you were a youngster. The heyday for quail, at least in Kansas, was in the 60s.
Okay.
1965 is the highest peak. If we look at harvest as an index of abundance, one of the interesting things about game birds typically is that hunter effort sort of mirrors abundance.
Yeah.
When there's a lot of quail, then folks are going to spend more hunter days out, and when there's not very many quail, then people are going to spend fewer hunter days. So we can use harvest as an index. Do you know what it's called when we take the harvest divided by the effort? There's never been any index used in fisheries management that uses that, is there?
No, we use catch per unit effort, quite a bit, but harvest per unit effort, I don't know.
Well, that's what I was thinking about. Was catch per unit effort's pretty common in fish, but we don't use that a lot in wildlife. They're easier to count sometimes, and we use different indexes. But there's been some big peaks and valleys in their abundance through time, and a lot of those boom and bust sort of cycles or changes in their population have to do with big weather events. Drought tends to be pretty hard on quail. We can also have bad weather conditions when they're nesting and that sort of thing. But really their biology, they are adapted to be a boom and bust species. So when times are good, they have pretty big clutches. So an average clutch is going to be like 13 eggs.
Wow.
And a pair of quail can pull off 3 clutches, or a female can pull off 3 clutches.
Really?
Yep. And during a growing season, an interesting thing about quail is you can have some male parental care. So the female may lay it and nest that she's going to attend, and also lay a nest that a male can attend. And those male-attended nests oftentimes don't have as high a survival as the female-attended nests do, but they can still attend them. So that, if they have an average number of eggs in both of those nests and both of them hatch, that's 26 chicks right there.
Yeah, that's quite a few.
Yeah.
Are we seeing that in the April, May timeframe? When are they laying their clutches?
Sure. So quail breeding can be anywhere from April up until about September.
Wow.
Kansas, based on like backdated broods and based on the size of the quail chicks that they're seeing in broods, it looks like the peak in breeding would be sort of in that May-June time frame. We see a peak hatch in July.
Yeah, but all the way out through September, huh?
Yeah, and there was a recent study conducted in Southwest Missouri that we'll talk about several things from today, but they were finding, like, I think at least in some of their years, half of the nests that they found from collared females were initiated after August 1.
Oh, wow.
So that's those nests would be hatching up into September.
Yeah. I've heard a lot of people worried about waiting too long to burn because they're afraid they're going to damage nests, and so if it's getting pushed back that far, maybe that's not as much of a concern as it's perceived to be.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different species that we might be thinking about.
Sure.
But if you're thinking about producing quail, most of our springtime burning, we're going to do. There might be a few nests that are initiated during that time frame, but a lot of the burning's done by June.
Yeah.
One of the other interesting things about that, since we're talking about nesting and the effects of fire, is that the areas that quail nest in tend to not be. So what we would burn during the summertime, what would have enough fuel in it for a growing season burn, would be too thick and too rank for very many quail nests to be out there. So quail are going to be finding some areas for their nests that maybe have at least a basketball-sized clump of grass and also include litter from the previous growing season under that. But it needs to be relatively open around that area too, so that those chicks can get out of the nest and get to what we would call brood rearing cover. So when we've got enough fuel out there to carry a fire, when we've got lots of green grass during the summertime, lots of humidity and that sort of thing, it's too thick for those quail to want to nest out there. So we tend to not have to worry about that with those growing season fires and like the September fires and that sort of thing.
Sure. Lots of considerations that could go into all that. Talking about fire is probably an episode of itself. Right?
Well, that's okay. I think the most important thing is, there a lot of people call quail firebirds.
Yeah.
The quail just about can't exist without having some prescribed fire management if we're talking about wild unsupplemented quail populations. So prescribed fire is really important for those birds.
Yeah, good information. You mentioned that weather events or climate events impact the populations quite a bit. Would we expect, we have a drought this year to just have a bad year this year? Does it kind of have a carryover effect? What are the population trends look like when we have those events?
It's interesting. And so what I'm going to say now is not necessarily something that I know good results from research papers, but it's talking based on my personal observations. Here in the Flint Hills or in native prairie country where we've got a lot of grazed rangeland, drought tends to lead to pretty heavy grazing. We're going to have some pretty intense grazing, and then if we get some moisture after that drought and that really intense grazing, then the next year we would expect to see a really big flush of those broadleaf plants that we call forbs, and that tends to produce a lot of that brood rearing cover that's really important for raising those chicks up. And so what I have seen myself is that after a drought, when we do get some moisture, we can see really, really good quail habitat conditions that can lead to at least partially contribute to that rebound, the boom coming off the bust.
Yeah, and if you're assuming you have some quail left around, they can lay 13 eggs up to 39 eggs.
Yeah,
I mean that's probably the high end, but quite a few, right? So you could see why they'd be able to rebound pretty quickly.
Yep.
So thinking about long-term trends, you said there's been some declines. Kind of what leads to that? Is that persistent drought over time, or what's really, or weather events? What's causing those declines?
Sure. So what we see in that long-term timeline of quail abundance are these big peaks and valleys, and those peaks and valleys before, let's say, the mid 80s. I said the biggest peak was 1965, but between 1965 and the mid to late 80s, we'd have a big crash, we'd have a bust, and then the next boom would come up at least pretty close to where they had been before. But as we start moving beyond that mid 80s time frame, you see that the booms result in less and less and less of a peak after the bust. So it looks like it's more of a function of not being able to recover as much when they do have that bust in their long-term population trend. So if we think about what's causing that, the thing that's consistent across the broadest area during that time frame is the habitat loss that we've had. And one of the things that's pointed to the most when we think about quail habitat is a loss of nesting or brood rearing cover. So those two really important components of reproductive cover for those quail. And most of that's generally related to changes in how we farm. If we go back to there's some really cool old papers, if we go back in the wildlife management literature, that look at like the composition of a typical farm, going back to like the 40s. And when you look at the composition of a typical farm going back that far, we see that if the average farm size back closer to when we homesteaded was 160 acres, right? That's what we homesteaded. That 160 acres might have been composed of, 20 acres of rangeland. And there also may have been 20 acres of oats and 20 acres of milo and maybe 20 acres of soybeans. And cereal grains were raised much more commonly back then than they are now. So not just wheat, but oats and rye and barley and some of those different cereal grains that we don't grow a lot of. But, if you think about 160 acres having 4 or 5 different little bitty fields on it, and then between each of those little bitty fields, you had an edge that probably had a lot of weeds in it. There wasn't really much weed management at all going on during that time. Even when we get to the 60s, in some of those images of the configuration of those farms, the reduction in the number of fields might have gone in half. And so now instead of 4 or 5 fields out there, there's 2. So we're getting closer to maybe 160 acres being our average field size. And then as we've moved through time, we've trended towards bigger and bigger and bigger fields. And quail being an edge species that really, really depend on having some grass to nest in, but also, within a relatively close proximity, within 100 or 200 yards of that grass where they're going to nest, they also need some area that's got tall weeds, that might be knee or waist high, that are relatively dense, or a crop that's going to have that same sort of structure. And then they need some woody cover too, that they can escape to during the winter time and during the growing season. And just lots of what we would call heterogeneity, right? Patchiness. And as we've started farming bigger and bigger, and getting rid of what we would call odd areas. That's a term that at least we used to use a lot when talking about wildlife habitat. An odd area might be a place where we feed cattle during the wintertime, but we don't do anything out there during the summertime. And so what happens? Well, you get all that disturbance from feeding cattle in there. You get all those nutrients, and that's going to be a big old ragweed patch, right? Or that's where you're going to have head-high marijuana or sunflowers or something. And then next to that, maybe that's where your grass is that they're nesting in. And we've just we've gotten much more homogenized, where it used to be really heterogeneous at smaller scales.
Yeah, lots of good information there. I mean, lots of different types of plants and habitat in general is what we need.
Yeah.
What about does it matter what the makeup is? Do cool season grasses and warm season grasses provide the same benefit? Does it matter what crop is out in the field, those types of things?
Sure. When we think about the different kinds of grasses, we can start there. Native warm season grasses, the native stuff, tends to grow in more of a patchy way on the surface of the ground. So, we talk about bunch grasses a lot. Well, little bluestem is a great example of a bunch grass. Every little bluestem plant is going to be sort of an isolated volleyball or basketball size cluster of stems. A lot of the other native warm season grasses, they don't necessarily form those little bitty bunches like that, but they still have lots of space between individual stems where they're growing out of the ground, unless we have a lot of litter from last year's growth or previous year's growth. The cool season, and not just cool season grasses, there's lots of cool season grasses that are native that grow in native prairie. But the cool season introduced grasses like tall fescue and smooth brome tend to form sod, and they grow so dense that there's not space for those little bitty chicks that can't fly yet, that are the size of my thumb, to move around down there in below the grass where they still have cover. We also tend to see more of a monoculture, so much less plant diversity out there in those cool season grass areas too. And plant diversity is important because it provides seeds for the adults from those forbs. But one of the reasons that those broadleaf plants are so important to quail chicks is that they're a nursery ground for insects. And, those soft-bodied insects and other arthropods like spiders are like 97% of the diet of quail chicks.
Wow.
They're easy to digest, and it's super available protein that helps them grow up fast.
So are the adults eating the same thing? Are they eating insects or grains? What are they eating?
Sure. The adults eat a lot of different things depending on what time of the year it is. So, especially during the winter months, they're going to mainly eat seeds of plants.
Yeah.
During the growing season, they're probably eating a few insects, but not like the chicks are. Yeah, but they do eat a lot more greens than a lot of people think about them doing. So new growth from those forbs, especially legumes and those sorts of things that are easy to digest.
One of the things that comes to mind when we talk about quail is I've heard a lot about eyeworms, right? And so are you familiar with those? Can you tell us a little bit about what those are?
Sure. So, it's a parasitic worm that the birds pick up in their food. It's going to be one of its earlier growth stages. I don't know if it's a larva or which actual stage it is. They're in grasshoppers, or they might even be in some of the caterpillars and that sort of thing. But I think they're mainly in grasshoppers. But they're getting them from their insect prey that they eat, and then those worms move to a part of their body, and in the quail, they move to their eyes. They're in a whole bunch of different species of birds, but it's basically a parasite that moves through the animal's body, settles in their eye, and it develops into an adult worm in their eye. As they get older and older, they can accumulate more and more worms. So if you end up with a really old quail, it's possible that it might have 5, 10, 11 eyeworms or something like that.
Wow.
Yeah, but they are a native parasite as long as as far as we know, as long as there's been birds in the central United States, they've had eyeworms. The main study that talks about eyeworms from Kansas that's published is a 2013 paper that Bob Robel published along with these grad students looking at the effects of eyeworm parasite loads in lesser prairie chickens. And they saw no physiological or demographic consequences to those lesser prairie chickens at low, medium, or high parasite burdens. So they didn't see reduced body mass. They didn't see reduced fats or other indications that those eyeworms were bad for them physically, and they didn't see any differences in nest success or survival of their offspring or anything like that either.
Yeah, one of the things that I've been told is that the worms eat the eyes and it makes the birds go blind, and so it would seem like either that's not happening, or if it is, it doesn't affect the bird's ability to thrive.
Yeah, I think it doesn't affect their ability to thrive because there would be some damage to their eye. They might still be able to see some, but as they accumulate more and more worms, they at some point would get to where they couldn't see.
Sure.
But an adult bird can still make it. There's lots of blind animals out there.
Yeah. So we're not going to see a population crash because there are some eyeworms in the bobwhite quail, more than likely. Huh?
No, we shouldn't. There was a podcast episode on a really popular podcast where a recent study was discussed about this, and it's in an area that has some of the highest eyeworm prevalences in quail that there are. They're really high in that part of Texas, and there are other parts of Texas that have fairly similar habitat conditions that don't have very high parasite loads, and from a demographic standpoint, they see similar nest success, similar survival of adults and chicks and all those sorts of things in the areas without high prevalences of eyeworm as they do in the areas with high prevalences. So they've had some natural experiments. But there was this huge population crash in 2012, 2013 in that area, so they had a bust. And one of the things that they were concerned about was that eyeworm was this smoking gun. And so they started looking at whether or not they should feed medicated feed. And that's what got all the press. And I've had a lot of questions from Kansas stakeholders about, should I be feeding this medicated feed to treat my quail for parasites so that there's more of them?
Well, what's the answer to that question?
Well, if you just look at the clear-cut results that were touted from that paper, it looks like that the medicated feed is the way to go. When you look more deeply into that study, there are some flaws with it. And I don't want to sit here and pick apart somebody else's work. But if that's something that somebody is really interested in, then I would suggest that they go talk to a quail biologist about it.
Sure. Yeah.
Because there's some things that people should be aware of there if they're thinking about that. If we think more specifically about Kansas, when all of this stuff was very first being discussed, they knew that this study was being conducted. They started looking at eyeworm prevalence in quail in Kansas. And so they collected hunter-harvested quail, and it was 283 total quail distributed across the state. I don't know if they did this across a couple of years or if it was 1 year or what. But they looked at those bobwhite samples, and like I said, they're distributed across the state from east to west. They found 4.2% prevalence.
That doesn't seem very high.
No, of eyeworms in quail. And so I think that the big take-home message from that is that regardless of what's happening elsewhere and regardless of what might be going on with some other study, we don't have the prevalence of eyeworms to make it make sense to try and treat for them, even if that could be something that helps their population.
So speaking of something else that might, in popular discussions at least, be
Yeah.
knocking down the numbers of quail. I hear a lot of times about predators, and predators can be coyotes, they can be, raccoons, whatever. So, I kind of, first of all, what are some of the predators of quail? And then I guess I'd like to know how concerned we should be about them. And are they knocking down the numbers? We get rid of all the predators. Will the quail jump back up? Just get your thoughts on all that.
Right. I think the most common answer that people hear from biologists when biologists talk about this is that habitat is the key.
Yeah.
And what we should know is there's lots of different predators. There's hawks that kill adult quail, especially Cooper's hawks and sharp-shinned hawks. Bobcats, of course, get a few adult quail. I'm sure that a coyote gets an adult quail every once in a while, but that'd be pretty rare. It's pretty, quail are fast. They're easy. They're good at detecting predators when they come in, and it would be pretty easy for them to get away from a coyote. If we think about quail nests, that's where the most predation probably occurs. So for quail nests, those same predators like coyotes and bobcats would get a few. Skunks, raccoons, opossums, armadillos, and then those are the ones that people think about the most, right? When we look at the critters that get quail nests or quail eggs, there's some. If we stay on mammals, sometimes it's like mice or ground squirrels.
Really,
will depredate a ground nesting bird nest, and so there's some weird ones like that. Back when people were really concerned about turkeys eating quail and turkeys getting quail nests, Charlie Lee put out a bunch of artificial quail nests in Kansas, and like he was seeing that cattle and deer depredated more of his artificial quail nests than a lot of the species that we would commonly think about. So of course they're just randomly encountering it.
Yeah.
If they're biting along, and why would they spit out an egg?
Sure.
There's a lot of protein, a lot of calories there, right? So there's some inadvertent take there, but the big underestimated critters are like snakes. Right? I mean, there's a lot of depredation that occurs on ground nesting birds like quail from snakes out there too. So they're important.
Well, that makes it sound, I'm hearing about people going out and trying to catch every raccoon that they can or every possum that they can. Coyotes are obviously popular, but makes it sound like there's so many things preying on them. Maybe we can't control predators enough to help out the quail. Would that be right? Or
well, it depends. The reason that biologists tend to shy away from talking about predator control is there's very, very few studies that show positive impacts from predator control, and a lot of times when we're looking at that, we're looking at predator control by itself. So independent of any habitat metrics, does killing skunks or does killing raccoons or removing whatever, can we increase quail production or production of other ground nesting birds by removing those predators? And an interesting study, I think, is one that was done by some folks down at Tall Timbers Research Station in Florida. It's one of the pinnacle quail research facilities in the world, really. But, they had very, very intensive habitat management already in place. They had the habitat where it needed to be. And then they decided they were going to conduct predator control on mammals. And they also did what we call a before-after control impact study design. So they measured quail nest success, breeding propensity, all those different measures before they started predator control. Then on part of their study sites, they implemented predator control and still measured everything at all their study sites, and then they flip-flopped them. So they started doing predator control at the sites that were their control sites, and then looked at everything and how it changed at the sites where they had previously done predator control but didn't do it now, right? So They also did something very different from what a lot of these other studies have done, and they hired 4 USDA Wildlife Services trappers to trap full-time from March to September on the areas where they were looking at predator control. So if we think about that, that's way, way more intense than the effort that most people put into this, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you've got people who are professional trappers, that's what they do for a living, and they're out there running a trap line 8 hours a day, 7 days a week from March to September. That's the kind of effort that we're talking about. And there are 4 study sites, so there must have been 2 trappers at each study site. And so they are one of the only studies that I've come across that shows a positive impact of predator control. So with that effort, they saw a 30% nest propensity increase. So they saw 30% more nests, 10% increase in nest success, 45% more chicks produced, and 18% increase in fall density. So from a hunter standpoint, what's that look like? That produced 0.2 of a quail per acre.
Wow.
With predator control. And that's with hiring 2 full-time people to trap full-time. The crazy thing to me is looking at some of the numbers that they removed of these different critters. So raccoon was a common one. Opossums were the species that they removed the most of. In 1 year, at one of the study sites, they removed 400 opossums.
Oh, wow.
From the site. Armadillos, so a couple of the sites, they removed over 100 armadillos. The most bobcats that they removed at a site looks like about 50. Several of the sites, they removed somewhere between 20 and 50 coyotes, and this is Florida, where coyote densities are probably quite a bit lower than what we have here. So the site where they removed the most predators, they removed 800.
Oh, wow.
Predators.
Yeah, that's a lot, and I guess it shows that you can remove enough, right? But that's a lot of effort, a lot of money to hire those people, and you got to wonder about removing that many predators. What's that going to look like, for the habitat, for example, right?
Yeah.
Or the other species that are there. So, that's, I don't know, a lot of numbers.
Yeah,
that would take a lot of effort to replicate that, in one of the sites that a homeowner or stakeholder would have on their property.
Yeah. For sure, and again, the habitat was addressed first.
Right, they already had that.
Yeah, and that's why it did show some impact here, and that's different from a lot of the other studies.
So thinking about habitat a little bit, predators. You've given us some ideas here. What can we be doing on our property if we want more quail? What are some tangible things? Hiring 4 full-time trappers isn't going to happen on our property out there for most of us, but what are some things we can tangibly be doing that would make a difference?
Yeah. So, nesting cover and brood rearing cover are the most common limiting factors throughout their range. So, first off, it doesn't make a lot of sense to try and give anybody recommendations without seeing a property and doing a habitat evaluation. Sure. But knowing that, do you have any native grass on your property? If you don't have any native grass on your property, then nesting cover is probably really, really, really limited. And if there's no nesting cover, it's going to be really hard to produce quail. That native grass needs to have some disturbance. So it needs to be grazed and burned, ideally, because that grazing is going to increase the plant diversity that's out there, and it's also going to help create that more patchy environment, because cattle don't eat every plant the same. So that just patchy grazing pattern creates that difference in structure, difference in plant composition, and everything. There was that same study in Southwest Missouri that I talked about. They compared what we would call traditional quail management, which was what you see on some wildlife areas where we got a strip of woody cover, a strip of food plot, a strip of grass, a strip of shrubs, a strip of trees, that very, very linear artificial habitat. They compared that with native prairie that had a fair bit of woody cover from brush, from shrubs, not necessarily trees, and looked at which had the most the best nest success, chick survival, adult survival, and all those sorts of things. For the most part, the native prairie that was burned and grazed had the highest chick survival, highest brood survival, and most of the reproductive parameters were better there too. And that's different from what a lot of people think. But the chicks actively avoided native grass that hadn't been burned or grazed for 2 years. So they selected native grass and had higher survival when the percentage of native grass in their home range that was burned and grazed within the last 2 years was higher. So it's important.
Yeah, get out there, manage habitat, right? That's normally the answer.
Yeah.
If we're thinking about wanting to harvest quail or hunt quail, how old are quail when we normally are out there harvesting them? Are they, living multiple years, or are they pretty young?
Sure. Quail can get to be like 5 years old in the wild, but the estimates are that like 80% of the quail in an average hunted population during hunting season are going to be less than a year old.
Oh, wow.
And that's coming from some numbers out of the Southeast. It might be a little bit higher here. But, the average quail out there was produced this year when we're hunting. When especially, we're flushing coveys. Those coveys are going to be, it may just be one brood. It may be the female that pulled off that brood, and just that brood. If you're only seeing a dozen birds, or if it's more than a dozen birds, then you might be seeing multiple broods that have come together. But a lot of those individuals are going to be chicks that were produced this year.
Yeah, and that probably goes, in addition to the habitat. How you harvest the animals probably is important too, right? You don't want to go track down every single and shoot every bird in that covey, or you won't have anything to repopulate that area too. So thinking about the harvest management side of things is maybe not as important as some of the other things, but just another consideration.
It is, for sure. And one of the interesting things about that is there was a study done in Kansas about 15 years ago that tied habitat conditions back to harvest. And so what they found was that they compared some native rangeland dominated areas to some cropland dominated areas, and they saw that hunting mortality was actually additive in areas that didn't have enough woody cover for the quail, because the quail escaped the hunters by getting into that woody cover. Another thing that they saw was that quail tended to do better in the cropland areas that they studied, but the rangeland-dominated areas in that study were overgrazed for the most part. So there, the quail were selecting the idle grass rather than the grass that was being burned and grazed, because they didn't have as good a range management going on out in that grassland. But woody cover can help those birds escape hunters, just like it does help them escape predation. The big difference is, a lot of times we'll see these numbers that might be out of South Texas or might be out of the Southeast that are recommending that we have 15 to 20% woody cover. That would be a lot of woody cover out in our tallgrass prairie. And so what they were seeing in that study that I was referencing was it was about 6% woody cover allowed those quail to escape the hunters out in that native rangeland.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's definitely important, if you can continually get to the birds that you flush out of one covey, you sure don't want to chase down every bird and harvest them out of a covey. You might, harvest one or two out of a covey and then move on and find another one.
Yeah. That's something easy to do sometimes if you're looking long term, but man, when they jump up in front of you and startle you, you got to have that plan, I think, is my point there, right?
Sure.
So going into the hunt, make sure that you understand that and the people you're hunting with understand that, so you can continue to see these birds over time.
Yep, yeah. And one or two in that instance might mean that every hunter in your party harvests one or two.
Sure.
Just mean that you can only harvest one or two out of a covey.
Well, great discussion today, Drew. I love talking about quail, and I love seeing them, hearing them, Yeah, they're definitely a fun species to have around, and lots of good information to keep managing our populations, learn a little bit more about them, and hopefully we can see more of these quail out on the properties that we're walking around. So thanks again to all our listeners for joining us. Make sure you check out our YouTube page and give us a like, and join us next time when we talk about an aquatic episode. Fins, Fur, and Feathers is hosted by K-State Research and Extension and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network and this podcast are supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act.